Inside Polunsky Unit, Texas, home of death row. In a remote corner of Texas stands a prison unlike almost any other in America. Behind its concrete walls live men who have been sentenced to die. Some have spent decades waiting for an execution date. Others wake up every morning knowing they may never leave their cells alive. This is the Polunsky Unit, the home of Texas death row. And what happens inside these walls is far different from what most people imagine. Before we begin, subscribe for more documentaries exploring prisons, crime, and the justice system, and comment where you're watching from. Because to understand the reality of death row, you first have to step inside one of the most feared prison units in the United States. The prison Texas built for death row. The Allen B. Polunsky Unit sits near Livingston, Texas, roughly 70 miles north of Houston. At first glance, it looks like many maximum security prisons scattered across America. Concrete buildings, barbed wire, guard towers, multiple layers of fencing. But appearances can be deceiving. Inside this prison is one of the most restrictive environments in the entire American correctional system. For decades, Texas has carried out more executions than any other state in the country. And because of that, the Polunsky Unit became something unique. Not simply a prison, but a place specifically designed to house condemned men waiting for execution. What makes this especially striking is that many people imagine death row inmates spending their final years together in large cell blocks, interacting freely with one another. That is not how Polunsky operates. In fact, what happens inside may feel closer to permanent isolation. And as we'll see later, many former prisoners describe that isolation as one of the most difficult parts of life on Texas death row. Arriving on death row. For a man sentenced to death in Texas, the journey to Polunsky begins immediately after sentencing. One moment he is sitting inside a courtroom. The next, he enters a completely different world. The bus ride itself can be long and silent. Many inmates know exactly where they are going. Some have seen news reports about the prison. Others have heard stories from jail inmates who passed through the Texas prison system. Most understand one fact. Their lives have changed forever. Upon arrival, the intake process begins. Property is inventoried. Records are reviewed. Medical evaluations are conducted. Security classifications are confirmed. But unlike prisoners entering general population, death row inmates face a future with extremely limited movement and almost no direct human contact. The rules they are about to encounter will shape every hour of every day. And for some men, those rules will remain unchanged for decades. Imagine learning that tomorrow will look almost exactly like today. And the day after that. And the day after that. For years. Maybe even for the rest of your life. That reality begins the moment the cell door closes. Inside the cells. The cells on Texas death row are small. Every inch serves a purpose. A steel bed. A toilet. A sink. Concrete walls. Heavy steel doors. This becomes an inmate's entire world. Unlike traditional prison housing units where prisoners often move through communal areas, Texas death row inmates spend the vast majority of their lives alone. The isolation is intentional. Officials argue that it increases security and reduces opportunities for violence. But critics have long questioned the psychological effects of keeping people confined this way for years. Or even decades. What happens to a person when meaningful social interaction almost disappears? The answer isn't simple. And as we'll discover later, different inmates react in dramatically different ways. Some adapt. Some struggle. Some deteriorate. A day on Texas death row. The day begins early. Long before sunrise, movement starts inside the housing area. Breakfast is delivered directly to the cells. Steel doors remain closed. Conversations happen through narrow openings or by shouting between neighboring cells. For many inmates, routine becomes everything. Without routine, the endless repetition can become overwhelming. Some read. Some exercise. Some write letters. Others spend hours studying religion, law books, or personal journals. Eventually comes recreation time. But even recreation looks different here. Prisoners are typically escorted individually to secure recreation cages. These outdoor enclosures allow limited access to fresh air and sunlight. Yet the isolation continues. No basketball games. No group activities. No communal yards. Just one man alone inside a fenced enclosure. For many Americans, this image captures the reality of Texas death row more than anything else. A person standing alone beneath the sky. Separated from nearly everyone. Waiting. The silence of isolation. One of the most controversial aspects of Polunsky Unit is prolonged solitary confinement. Years ago, Texas moved away from the older death row system where inmates had greater interaction. Security concerns played a major role. Several violent incidents, including murders committed by death row prisoners against other inmates, forced officials to reconsider how the unit operated. The result was a dramatically stricter environment. Today, isolation defines daily life. And isolation affects people differently. Some prisoners become intensely disciplined. Others develop routines so detailed they can account for nearly every minute of the day. But not everyone handles it successfully. Mental health experts have debated the effects of long-term solitary confinement for decades. Questions continue to be asked. Can a human being remain psychologically healthy after years of near-total isolation? What happens after 10 years? 20? 30? Inside Polunsky, those questions are not theoretical. They are part of everyday life. And what happens next reveals another side of death row that many people never consider. Survival rules. Even in isolation, prison culture still exists. Survival requires understanding unwritten rules. Respect matters. How inmates communicate matters. Reputation matters. Many prisoners spend years observing others through conversations shouted down the tier. Relationships develop despite physical separation. Information travels. News spreads. Conflicts emerge. Friendships form. Veteran prisoners often understand the system better than newcomers. They know the schedules, the officers, the routines, the procedures. In a place where daily life rarely changes, knowledge becomes valuable. Small mistakes can create problems. And on death row, problems have a way of lingering. The men who live here. Polunsky houses individuals convicted of some of the most serious crimes imaginable. Many cases attracted national attention. Others barely made local headlines. But every inmate arrives with a story. Some maintain their innocence. Others openly admit responsibility. Some continue fighting appeals for decades. Others eventually stop. One of the strange realities of death row is the passage of time. Years become decades. Court hearings come and go. Attorneys change. Governors change. Presidents change. Entire generations grow up outside the prison walls. Yet some inmates remain exactly where they started. Waiting. The uncertainty can be difficult to comprehend. Not knowing whether an execution will happen next year. Or 20 years from now. That uncertainty becomes its own form of punishment. Visits from the outside world. Despite the isolation, inmates are not completely cut off from the outside world. Family visits remain possible under strict procedures. These meetings often take place through secure barriers. No handshakes. No hugs. No physical contact. Only conversation. For families, the experience can be heartbreaking. Parents watch their children grow older through glass. Children become adults while their fathers remain incarcerated. Relationships survive. Others collapse under the pressure. Some inmates receive frequent visits. Others receive none. Years can pass without seeing a familiar face. And when human contact becomes rare, even a brief conversation can take on enormous importance. Execution day. Eventually, for some inmates, appeals run out. Execution dates are scheduled. And the atmosphere changes. Even inside a highly controlled prison, everyone knows when an execution is approaching. Staff know. Inmates know. Attorneys know. Families know. The final days often become a period unlike any other. Legal teams continue filing motions. Family members make last visits. Media attention increases. The clock begins counting down. What makes Texas unique is the scale at which executions have historically been carried out compared to other states. Over the years, the state has executed hundreds of inmates. Each case follows a complex legal process. But once the final appeals end, events move quickly. And that leads to one of the most closely watched procedures in the American justice system. The final transfer. Many people assume executions occur inside the Polunsky Unit. They do not. When an execution date arrives, the inmate is transferred to the nearby facility known as the Huntsville Unit. There, Texas carries out executions in a dedicated execution chamber. The journey is short in distance, but enormous in significance. For years, sometimes decades, the inmate has lived inside a death row cell. Now comes the final transfer. A process that marks the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Few moments in the American correctional system carry greater weight. And regardless of where someone stands on capital punishment, the gravity of that moment is impossible to ignore. The officers behind the walls. Any discussion of Polunsky Unit must also include the staff. Correctional officers work inside one of the most challenging environments in the prison system. Every day requires vigilance. Every movement follows procedure. Every interaction carries potential consequences. Many officers spend years working these housing areas. They learn routines, recognize personalities, understand tensions before they escalate. Their role is often overlooked in public discussions about death row. Yet they are present every day, maintaining security inside a facility where emotions can run high and stakes remain constant. Working in such an environment carries its own pressures. And those pressures rarely stay behind when a shift ends. The debate that never ends. Beyond the prison walls lies a debate that has divided Americans for generations. Supporters of capital punishment argue that certain crimes deserve the ultimate punishment. They point to victims, families, public safety, justice. Opponents raise different questions. Questions about wrongful convictions, human rights, mental health, the effectiveness of the death penalty itself. Polunsky Unit sits directly at the center of that debate. Not as an argument, not as a political statement, but as a physical place where those competing views become reality. Inside its cells live the human consequences of decisions made by courts, juries, lawmakers, and society. And that reality is far more complicated than slogans from either side. Life measured in appeals. For most prisoners, time is measured in months or years remaining on a sentence. On Texas death row, time is often measured differently. It is measured in appeals. A court hearing becomes a milestone. A legal filing becomes an event. A decision from a judge can alter the course of years. Many inmates spend countless hours studying their own cases. Legal papers become some of the most important possessions inside the cell. Boxes of transcripts, witness statements, police reports, and court decisions accumulate over decades. Some prisoners become remarkably knowledgeable about the legal system. Not because they plan to, but because their lives depend on understanding it. Imagine spending 20 years reading the same case file, looking for one detail that might have been overlooked, one mistake, one inconsistency, one legal argument that could change everything. For some inmates, that search becomes a full-time occupation. Others eventually lose faith in the process. Years of denied appeals can wear down even the most determined individuals. And yet, every so often, a case changes unexpectedly. A conviction is overturned. New evidence emerges. A sentence is reconsidered. Those rare outcomes keep hope alive for many condemned prisoners, even when the odds seem impossibly small. How inmates communicate. One of the strangest aspects of life inside Polunsky is how communication evolves. Most people assume isolation means complete silence. The reality is more complicated. Prisoners learn to communicate through walls, vents, doors, and long-distance conversations shouted across housing areas. Over time, entire social networks can emerge despite physical separation. News travels surprisingly fast. If an inmate receives a major court decision, others often hear about it. If someone is transferred, word spreads. If tension develops between prisoners and staff, people talk. In many ways, information becomes a form of currency. Not money. Not possessions. Information. Who knows what? Who heard what? Who can confirm what? The flow of information creates a strange sense of community inside an environment designed to separate people. And sometimes, those connections become essential for survival. Because what happens when isolation stretches beyond years? How does a person keep their mind occupied? The answer varies from cell to cell. Fighting boredom and despair. One of the greatest challenges on death row is not physical danger. It is monotony. Every day follows familiar patterns. The same walls. The same door. The same routines. For many inmates, maintaining mental discipline becomes a necessity. Some exercise relentlessly. Push-ups. Sit-ups. Walking short circles inside the cell. Again and again. Others read constantly. History. Religion. Fiction. Philosophy. Anything capable of breaking the routine. Writing is also common. Letters to family. Personal journals. Poetry. Reflections. Some inmates produce thousands of pages over the course of their incarceration. Words become a way to travel beyond the walls. A way to remain connected to the outside world. Yet not everyone succeeds in adapting. The psychological pressure can be immense. Days blend together. Weeks disappear. Months become difficult to distinguish from one another. And eventually, some prisoners begin asking a question that has no easy answer. How do you maintain hope when you do not know what the future holds? The sound of an execution date. There is a moment that changes everything on death row. The announcement of an execution date. Until that point, uncertainty dominates daily life. A prisoner may know execution is possible, but no specific deadline exists. Once a date is set, uncertainty begins to disappear. And something else takes its place. Finality. Even inmates housed far away often become aware when an execution approaches. Conversations change. The atmosphere shifts. Attention turns toward the legal process unfolding outside the prison. Appeals become urgent. Deadlines become critical. Every hour suddenly matters. For families, the experience can be devastating. Years of uncertainty transform into a countdown. For attorneys, the workload intensifies dramatically. For prison staff, preparations begin according to established procedures. And for the condemned inmate, every day acquires a significance it never had before. Because for the first time, the future has a specific date attached to it. Men who waited decades. One of the most remarkable realities of Texas death row is how long some inmates remain there. Decades are not unusual. A man sentenced in his 20s may reach middle age before his legal process concludes. Some arrive with dark hair and eventually grow old behind bars. The world outside continues moving forward. Technology changes. Cities expand. Entire industries appear and disappear. But inside the prison, daily life remains largely unchanged. Think about everything that can happen in 20 years. Children become adults. Parents grow elderly. Friends move away. Communities transform. Now imagine watching all of that happen from a single cell. Unable to participate. Unable to return. Only able to observe from a distance through letters, news reports, and occasional visits. The passage of time becomes one of the defining features of life on death row. And for some inmates, it becomes one of the heaviest burdens. When violence reaches death row. Although death row is heavily controlled, violence has still played a role in its history. In fact, some of the strict policies used today were influenced by violent incidents that occurred years earlier. Prison administrators constantly face a difficult challenge. How do you manage inmates convicted of serious crimes while maintaining safety for both staff and prisoners? Every correctional system wrestles with that question. At Polunsky, the answer has often involved increased restrictions, additional security, reduced opportunities for direct contact. Supporters argue these measures protect lives. Critics argue they create other problems. The debate continues. But there is little disagreement about one thing. Maintaining order inside a death row facility requires extraordinary attention to security. Every procedure exists for a reason. Every movement is planned. Every risk is evaluated. Because when mistakes happen inside maximum security prisons, the consequences can be severe. What the public never sees. Most people will never see the inside of the Polunsky Unit. Their understanding comes from headlines, television reports, court cases, political debates. But those sources rarely capture the daily reality. The reality is often quieter, less dramatic, more repetitive. Life on death row is not constant action. It is routine, waiting, paperwork, meals, exercise, court filings, letters, conversations shouted through steel doors, and then more waiting. That may be one of the most difficult truths to understand. The defining characteristic of death row is not necessarily fear. It is time. Time moving slowly. Time accumulating. Time becoming almost tangible. And for many inmates, that passage of time becomes the punishment itself. The legacy of Polunsky. Today, the Polunsky Unit remains one of the most closely watched prisons in America. Not because of its size. Not because of its architecture. But because of what it represents. It stands at the intersection of crime, punishment, justice, and morality. Every inmate housed there arrived through a legal process that fundamentally altered the course of their life. Every officer who works there operates inside one of the most demanding environments in corrections. Every family connected to the prison carries a story shaped by loss, separation, or grief. And behind every cell door exists a reminder of the enormous power exercised by the criminal justice system. The prison was built to contain society's most serious offenders. But over time, it became something else as well. A symbol. A place where some of the country's most difficult questions continue to play out every day. Questions about accountability. Questions about punishment. Questions about redemption. Questions that remain unresolved. And perhaps that is why the Polunsky Unit continues to attract so much attention. Because behind the concrete walls and razor wire is more than a prison. It is a place where law, morality, and human lives collide. And long after the lights go out and the corridors fall silent, those questions remain. Waiting. Just like the men inside. The Polunsky Unit remains one of the most controversial prisons in America. Behind its walls, men sentenced to death live in near total isolation, waiting for a future that is often uncertain until the very end. Whether viewed as justice, punishment, or a subject of ongoing debate, one thing is undeniable: the realities of death row are far more complex than most people ever see. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, be sure to subscribe for more in-depth stories exploring prisons, crime, and the justice system. Until next time, stay curious.